Okay, so we can now start to create our jQuery plugin. Don't worry, this isn't very complicated at all. What we're doing is very simple, but as you've seen, has a really good effect here. So what we first of all want to do is pull in jQuery, because obviously we're depending on jQuery to utilize its functionality to be able to extend it and create this plugin. So I'm going to create a script tag down here to pull in jQuery. Now you can either host this on your own server, or you can go ahead and use a CDN like Google hosted libraries. It's entirely up to you, but this is an easy way if you just want to quickly include it just to play around. So I've come over to Google hosted libraries, just Google for it, you'll find it, and I'm pulling in jQuery 2.1.1. So let's paste that into there. So now we have jQuery included on our page. What we now want to do is create a JavaScript file that's going to hold our Modal plugin. So I'm going to put this in a JS directory, and I'm going to call it modal.jQuery.js. Typically this is the name of your plugin, so you can call it whatever you want. So inside of our directory then, let's create a JS folder, and in here let's create a new file and save this out as modal.jQuery.js. Pretty straightforward, and there is our file where we're going to write the plugin. Now down here I'm going to have some script tags which I'm going to use to use the plugin, and we saw in the introduction that we used this on a modal selector. So what we now need to do before we start writing any of this code is determine how we want these links to look, how we want this to pull in content. So I'm going to create an anchor here, and this is going to be a modal that's going to bring up a piece of content relating to just fruit. Obviously this can be anything. So the href is going to be hash because we don't want this to link anywhere at all. We're not linking off, we're just showing something. So we're going to give this a class of modal. Again, this can be called whatever you want. This isn't styled, it's just purely so we can use a jQuery selector to take anything with a class of modal and then go ahead and show a modal window. Now what we also want to do is use something called a data attribute, which jQuery gives us functionality. It gives us a data method that allows us to quickly pick up any content within a data attribute. And this data attribute can be called anything. You can put anything you want here. So in this case, I'm just going to call this data content, and then within this value, I'm going to specify what this content is, or rather where this content is. So this can be anything you want. It can be a PHP file. It can be anything that's shown appropriately on your server. So just anything really. So we're going to create a folder in here called content. You probably wouldn't do this normally, but this is just going to house the different content that we want to show within our modal windows. In this case, I'm going to have a file called fruit.html, and we'll just say apple, pear, banana, whatever you want. And in here then we would say we want to load in within the content directory fruit.html. Again, we'll look at doing this with a test PHP file as well, so we know that we can use dynamic content. So let's just duplicate this down then, and we'll say people, and in here we'll say server. This is going to be our PHP file. So in here let's say people, and in here let's say server, and let's call this PHP. Well, we'll give this a PHP extension because this is going to be a PHP file. So in here then let's create a new file, and let's call this people.html, and we'll just put a couple of names in here like so. Done. So we can close these off and just leave them until we get to loading the content in via an Ajax request. So the last one to create then is server.php, which just is a PHP file outputting this is a PHP file. Easy as that. So we've got a few bits of content to test with. Now we want to go in and create our plugin, our Modal plugin. So we'll create the basis of the plugin, and then we'll test that it actually works by just maybe outputting something. So what we need to do to start to create this plugin is create a self-invoking function. And within this, we want to pass the $, which is essentially relates to jQuery. And then in here, what we want to pass in is jQuery. So in here then, we can do whatever we want. So we can console log $, and this dollar is going to allow us to access jQuery functionality within here. Let's take a look at what this does when we actually load the page up. So make sure you've got your developer tools open. When you refresh, you can see that we've now got this here. So what we can actually do inside of here is extend jQuery's function set, if you like, and we can call this whatever we want. So we're saying we want to create something on here which happens to be a function, and that's going to allow us to enter any functionality we need in here, and then this would act as a plugin. So in here then, let's do a console log, and let's say works. And don't forget to end that as well. So inside of here then, when we go ahead and use the plugin, at the moment we're not using it, so we're not seeing any content output. If we go ahead and use a selector and we say anything with a class of modal, we want to apply modal on, then that's going to output works. So we now know that the actual function that we've defined within here, within FN, within jQuery, works. And the reason we can use a selector and then use this method is because we're extending jQuery's function or function set. So what we want to do then is allow for options to be passed into this function, because we're going to have default options. We're also going to have options like which class you want to choose. You don't have to do this, but it makes it easy if you want to change around which class you're using for your modal, your close element, and your shade as well. So I'm going to call this opt, short for options. And in here, what we want to do is I'm going to call or create a variable called settings or options, whatever you want. And in here, what we're going to do is use the extend method, passing in a object, and then we're going to extend this from options. So essentially what this means is we can provide defaults within here, and anything within here will then override these settings. So we've got our settings here, and then we're overriding anything that's passed in. In fact, let's just tidy this up and define this var up here like so. And we're going to be doing that for every function. So let's go ahead and define some of the default options. So for modal then, we might want the default class to be jQuery modal. We might then want the close class to be jQuery modal close. We might want the close text to just be nothing as by default, or close, or whatever you want. And for the shade class, we might want this to be jQuery modal shade. So in here then, let's go ahead and do a console log on settings, and we'll see what this yields. And there we go. So we've got our object, we've got the defaults being output here. Now let's take a look at what happens when we try to override these. And to override them, all we do is we pass in an object here. So for modal, I'm going to say just change, just so we can see that that works. So when we refresh now, you can see that the modal property has the value changed, and the rest just have what we defined as options. So this is how this works. Now, we already built in the last part the actual classes for the modal window, the modal close button, the modal shade. So we know that we can override these. So I'm going to say modal window, which is our class. Close is going to be modal close. The close text we'll set to close, and the shade we'll set to modal shade. If, for example, you just were happy with having no text in there, maybe you were rendering some kind of icon on this, you could just remove that and you would just get no text. So that's where the options come in handy. So now we've got all of our classes being overridden in the settings, which we can then use within the code here. So if we think about it, the first thing that we want to do is attach an event handler to these elements here. And actually, let's just take these and put them within our container just so they look a bit nicer on the screen so we can see them a little bit better. So let's just put them inside of there, like so. There they are. So we need to attach an event handler to this. When we click it, we want a modal to appear. That's the first step that we want to take. So what we can say is this, and we can use the on method, and we provide the event, and we provide a callback. Now this refers to the element that's currently being targeted using this plugin. So all of these are obviously have this plugin attached to them. So when I say this click, what I'm saying is the current item that we are listening for. So I'm going to create a variable in here called self, and that's going to be equal to this, which basically means the current element, just so we don't have to keep doing this over and over again. So let's do a console log on self.data content. So what that means is grab the data attribute called content and just console log it. So in this case, when I hit fruit, we get content fruit. When I hit people, we get content people, and as you'd imagine, content server for that one. So we now know that they're acting as their own thing, if you like. So what do we want to do? We want to make an Ajax request to that file that's contained within that data content attribute. So we can do this really easily with jQuery, and we use the Ajax method for this. We pass in an object here, and this contains things like the URL, the request type, whether you want to cache it, what happens when it's finished, blah, blah, blah. So the URL, what's this URL going to be? Well, we're not going to do any checking here or anything like that. We're just going to pass in self.data and then content, simple as that, which is what we've just seen console logged. We're then going to choose the type of request. In this case, it's going to be a get. That's pretty obvious. And the cache is going to be set to false, just so everything stays up to date when we click it. And that's pretty much it. So we have a couple of ways of determining whether something has finished, an Ajax request is finished. One way is to do a success callback like this, and then run some code in here. The other way is to use .done at the end of this like that. So I'm going to be using this way, but go ahead and check the jQuery manual and take a look at what these do and understand how they work. Essentially, when the Ajax request is finished, we're then going to run a callback here. So this callback contains an argument, which is the data that's taken from this file. So in this case, again, we're going to use console log. We'll be doing this quite often just to see what we're working with. We're going to console log the data. So this is pretty straightforward. When I click through, we get that data from that file. Same with people, and the same with server. It's outputting what we outputted with PHP. So we're going to do something in here with that data, and that's obviously going to be placing it within that modal window. So we also need to cater for if there was an error accessing the file content, maybe the file errored or it couldn't be found. So I'm going to create a callback here to do something when there's errors. Now we're going to create a general way to display a modal, and we're going to do that by creating a function. So at the top here, let's go ahead and define another variable that we're going to use. This is going to be create modal. This is in fact going to be a function. And down here then, let's do this under settings actually. This is going to be called create modal, and that's going to be a function. And we're going to call this from within here. So we're calling that method or function rather within here, passing in something. And we'll do the same thing when there is an error. You can handle this in any other way that you want. So this create modal function that we have created up here needs to take some data. So I'm going to write data. And then I can pass that data directly from this into here. But what happens if there's an error? Well, in this case, all I want to pass in is there was an error. Again, feel free to handle this how you want. So inside of this create modal function, what do we need to do? Well, we need to create the elements, append them to whatever we need to append them to. So we're putting the close button inside the modal. We're then going to generate the shade and put that on the body element. So we need some way to attach these elements to the body. So up here, body, and then down here somewhere we can say body equals body. So we do a jQuery select on the body element, and of course that is this here, because we want to inject this markup that we're going to generate onto the body. So inside of create modal, this is the longest function that we're going to write. You could feel free to sort of split it up if you want to, but in this case we want to generate the shade, the close button, and the modal. So let's create some variables at the top of this function for that. So shade, close, and modal. And down here we want to, let's start with something pretty straightforward. We'll start with the shade. So in jQuery, obviously you can just write the markup as it is and then just append it onto the body or prepend it onto the body. But we're not going to do that. We're going to create the elements in a much better way. So in this case, we use a selector style syntax to generate a div. This will generate a div element. And as a second argument, we can then pass an object in here with things like the class, etc. So the class of this is going to be settings.shade. So we're taking from the settings here the class that we specified in the settings. So that's now going to create a div element with a class of, in this case, it will be modal-shade. So now that we've done that, we can go ahead and append this or prepend this onto the body. So we can say body.prepend shade. Simple as that. So let's take a look at what happens now when we click this, and there we go. And you can see in your Element Explorer that that has created a div with a class of modal shade, and it is now at the top of the body appended on, or at the top of this body element. So that's pretty cool. We've made a little bit of progress here, and we know that we can now do the same thing with the modal window. We can generate the markup and insert that. But for the shade, we want to know that we can click the shade and remove that modal window and everything. So I'm just going to attach an event handler here to say on click, I want to run a callback, and this is to do later. We want to close the modal and the shade, like so. So we'll come back to that a bit later. Let's generate the modal window now. So the modal window, we're doing pretty much the same thing here. We're just going to create a div. We're going to pass an object in here, and we want to define things like the text that's going to go in it, which is going to be whatever is returned from that Ajax request, which remember is within this data argument here. So let's do that now. We're going to use the HTML property because we may be working with HTML. We want that to render as HTML, so we want to use HTML rather than text, which you might see. So in here, what we want to do is just write data. That's it. So now we can define the class of this. We know that's settings.modal, much like we did for settings.shade. That just takes the class that we pass in and applies it to this modal. And that's pretty much it for now. Let's look at prepending this as well. Now you can chain on selectors, so you can say prepend again, but luckily jQuery allows you to do just comma separated list of things. So let's check this out, and there we go. So we've actually got this pretty much working. We can click on any of these and they're going to show us our window. We can't click and remove these at the moment because we haven't implemented that functionality. We've also not created the close button to close this as well. So let's again do pretty much the same thing here and generate the close button. So we say close. This time though, that's not a div, it's just an anchor. So we say a, and then we close that. And then we pass in the properties that we want this close button to have. In this case, the text is going to be settings.closeText, again, which is pulled in from the settings. And we want this to have a class of settings.close. And we want the href to be hash. I'm not sure you need to do this when you're generating markup. I'm not positive, but it's nice to just include it anyway. So what we need to do now is figure out how to put this close button on this modal here. And that's pretty easy. When we generate this markup, we can just chain on the append method and then pass in this close element. So what that's then going to do is when we click it, we now have this element here. If we check out the markup here, you can see that we've got the modal window, we've got the content, and then we've got this anchor at the bottom, which we've appended on. Pretty straightforward. You could also wrap this content within another element if you needed to add any additional styling or padding, but for now we'll keep this as simple as possible. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's deal with actually closing this modal. At the moment when we click this, nothing happens. When we click the shade, nothing happens. So we need to create some event handlers or attach some event handlers to this close button as well. So let's do this. So on click of this close button, we have a callback here. And we want to do the same thing as we do when we click the shade. So let's copy and paste this comment in. So we're now going to create a new function which deals with closing a modal, because what we need to do is close the modal and the shade, depending on, well, regardless of if we click on the shade or the close button. So we want to go ahead and say close modal up here, just define our variables at the top of this function. And down here, let's say close modal equals a function, and that's going to take in a modal and shade. So we can define the modal and the shade that we want to remove. So let's just stick a semicolon there. All we want to do is say modal.remove, which will remove that element from the DOM, and shade.remove. So because we're using or we're creating these with a jQuery selector, they obviously extend jQuery, so we can use the remove method on these. So all we need to do here is within the shade, we need to say close modal and pass in the modal and the shade. And down here, we want to do the same thing, close modal, modal and the shade. Now there's something else we need to do down here in just a moment. I'll speak about that in a second. But now when I click on this and click the shade, that basically removes them elements. You can see them go from here. And as well, when we click the close button, they also remove as well. But let's take a look at what happens if we were to scroll down. Let's actually change the position to fixed, and we'll see why this is a problem. So let's say a user comes and clicks on this, scrolls down a little bit maybe, and then goes ahead and clicks close. Look what happens where the sort of position of the page that we're at. It takes us straight to the top. That might not be desirable. So what we can do is when we actually register this event handler, we can pass in this e argument, and we can say e.prevent default, and that will prevent the default behavior that clicking that anchor does. So when I click this and I scroll down and I click close, we remain in exactly the same position on the page. It doesn't really matter for the shade because there's no default action for clicking a div, but with an anchor it's always going to take you to a hash if you have that defined. So we've tackled both them problems. While we're on the subject of preventing default behavior, when we actually click on the anchor that opens up the modal window, if I just scroll my browser down to about here and click that, you see that also takes us to the top of the page. So what we could do is also implement this prevent default behavior in here by just saying, again, e.prevent default, like so. And that's then going to tackle the problem of clicking this. We see that we stay in exactly the same position. So I can close that off now. So that is pretty much it. We've created a very basic jQuery modal plugin. This could be extended and obviously could contain a lot more functionality, a lot more ability for customization. But for now, if you're looking either to just learn jQuery or create a very simple modal window for your website, then we've done so. And there we go. We've created a very simple jQuery modal plugin.